Picture this. China, 1900. The Boxer Rebellion is at its peak. Foreign missionaries are being hunted down and executed in the streets. The imperial government has issued a decree. Any Chinese convert to Christianity faces death. Villages are burning. Churches are being torn down brick by brick. And one woman walks straight into it. No weapon, no escort, no government protection. Just a small, plain-faced woman from Hamilton, Ontario, carrying a worn leather Bible and the absolute conviction that God had told her to go. Her name was Mabel Adelaide Moyer. And what happened next is one of the most extraordinary and most heartbreaking stories of faith this generation has never heard. A woman who saw the blind see and the dying rise from their beds, who built schools and hospitals and orphanages from nothing, who poured out everything she had for a people not her own, and who, in the end, died in a mud brick room alone, having outlived every dream she thought God had promised her. Have you ever walked through a door you were certain God opened, only to find devastation on the other side? It is January 14th, 1870. Mabel Adelaide Moyer is born in a farmhouse outside Waterloo, Ontario, the third of 7 children. Her father, Harold, is a quiet, deliberate man, a Mennonite farmer who reads scripture at supper every night and speaks of God the way he speaks of weather, plainly, without ornamentation, as a fact of life. Her mother, Ruth, is the one who prays loud. Ruth prays with her whole body, rocking at the kitchen table with her eyes pressed shut and her hands flat on the wood, and young Mabel watches her from the doorway and thinks, I want whatever she has. But the Moyer household knows grief early. In the winter of 1878, Mabel's older brother Nathan contracts typhoid fever. He is 11 years old. He is dead in 9 days. The following spring, her youngest sister Pearl follows him, just 4 years old, taken by diphtheria before she'd ever lost a baby tooth. Mabel is 8. She stands at Pearl's graveside in the wet April mud and feels something shift inside her chest, some tectonic thing, and she will write about this moment 40 years later. It was the first time I understood that this world was broken, and it was the first time I wondered if God had the nerve to fix it. That question, does God have the nerve, would follow her for the rest of her life. She is 16 when she attends a revival meeting at a church hall in Guelph. The evangelist is a broad-shouldered man from Pennsylvania who speaks without notes and sweats through his collar and tells the story of Paul on the Damascus Road, with such clarity that Mabel feels, quite literally, that the light is happening in the room. She walks forward that night. She doesn't tell her parents for 3 days. When she finally does, her father nods slowly over his porridge and says, I thought something happened to you. He doesn't explain how he knew. The years between her conversion and her calling are not quiet years. She teaches school in a one-room schoolhouse in Elmira. She falls in love with a young man named Fletcher, a bookkeeper, sensible, gentle, and they come very close to engagement. But something keeps pulling at her, a restlessness she can't name. She reads everything she can find about China. Missionary reports, geography books, newspaper dispatches about the Qing dynasty and the millions of people in the interior provinces who have never heard the name of Jesus Christ. She reads Hudson Taylor. She reads accounts of women dying in Chinese villages because no male doctor was permitted to treat them, and something in her hardens into decision. She applies to the China Inland Mission in 1894. She is 24 years old. Fletcher asks her not to go. He stands in her parents' front parlor on a Tuesday evening in November, hat in hand, and he says, Mabel, I believe you love God, but I don't think God requires this of you. She looks at him for a long moment. She is fond of him. She understands that she is choosing something she cannot fully explain over something solid and real and good. She says, Fletcher, I think he does. She means it as gently as she can. She sails from Vancouver in the spring of 1895. The first years in Shanxi province are brutal in ways she hadn't imagined. The language is not just difficult, it is another world, a different architecture of thought, and she studies it with the ferocity of someone who understands that every character she learns is a door into a life she might actually reach. Her colleague at the mission station, a taciturn Scottish woman named Mrs. Forsyth, tells her on her 3rd week, You'll lose your confidence at month 6 and want to go home. Everyone does. The ones who stay past month 7 are the ones God actually sent. Mabel stays. Month 7 arrives, she stays. By 1898, her Mandarin is strong enough to teach. She begins a school for girls in the village of Linfen. 12 students, a rented room, textbooks she has handwritten herself because there are none in the local dialect. Word spreads. 20 students. Then 40. Fathers who would never have permitted their daughters to study begin appearing at her door with children in tow, because they have heard that the foreign woman's school produces girls who can read contracts and keep accounts and hold their own in negotiation. Mabel does not argue doctrine with these fathers. She teaches the girls to read. She trusts the rest to God. And then 1900 arrives, and everything she has built is set on fire. The Boxer uprising sweeps through Shaanxi with a ferocity that the mission reports back home cannot capture. This is not persecution in the abstract. This is neighbors turning on neighbors. Chinese Christians are dragged from their homes and given a choice: recant or die. Most of the foreign missionaries in the province flee. The China Inland Mission orders its workers south. Mabel receives the directive in writing. She does not go. She will spend the rest of her life trying to explain why, and she will never fully succeed. She writes in her journal that she knelt in her room for 4 hours before she made the decision, and that at the end of those 4 hours she felt, not peace exactly, but clarity. A certainty so complete it frightened her more than the mobs outside. She writes, "If I leave now, every one of those girls will be told that the foreign woman's God was not worth dying for. I cannot let that be the last lesson I teach them." She stays. She hides 12 of her students in the storage rooms beneath the school. She negotiates. In fluent Mandarin, alone without a translator, with a local magistrate, a man named Commissioner Feng, who has some sympathy for her, and even more for the fact that her school has educated the daughters of several legmen he respects. Feng delays. He buys time. It is not heroic diplomacy. It is exhausting, terrifying, humiliating diplomacy conducted over weeks. And Mabel writes about it with a dry precision that makes clear she was shaking through most of it. All 12 girls survive. When the uprising collapses and the foreign powers impose the Boxer Protocol, Mabel emerges from those months changed in ways she will not be able to articulate for years. She has watched things that cannot be unseen. She has buried people she loved. 2 of her Chinese teachers, a young man named Wei, who had been converted through the school and who was killed 3 days before the worst of the violence passed. She stands at his grave in the autumn of 1900 and feels that same shifting in her chest she felt at Pearl's grave in 1878, except this time it goes deeper. This time it reaches somewhere she had thought was protected. She writes home to her mother, "I believe God was here. I also believe things happened that should not have happened. I do not yet know how to hold both of those things at once. I am trying." She rebuilds. This is perhaps the most quietly extraordinary thing about Mabel Moyer. She is not a dramatic person. She does not perform faith. She simply continues. She opens the school again in 1901 with 15 students and the same rented room, which now has a crack running the length of one wall from where a section of the roof had collapsed. She holds class in her coat through February. She writes grant applications to mission boards in Toronto and London. She is refused twice and accepted once and uses the money to repair the roof and purchase a second room. By 1905, the school has 83 students. She has started a small clinic, staffed by a Chinese doctor trained in Peking who comes twice a week. She has trained 6 women as midwives. Infant mortality in the immediate area drops by something that she estimates in a letter to the mission board at perhaps a third, though we have no reliable figures from before. So I am guessing, and I want you to know I am guessing. This is characteristic of her. She will not overclaim. In an era when missionary reports are full of numbers that have been softened and rounded and made impressive for donors, Mabel's reports are blunt to the point of being off-putting. She writes, "We prayed for a woman named Fen this week, who had been bedridden for 3 years. She stood up and walked. I do not know what to make of this medically. I know what I saw." She sends the report. The mission board finds it difficult to quote in their fundraising materials. The years from 1905 to 1918 are the years she later calls, with characteristic understatement, the good years. The clinic becomes a proper dispensary. A young Canadian doctor named Howard Elkin arrives in 1909 and takes over the medical work, and he and Mabel develop the kind of working relationship that sustains you when everything else is exhausting. a friendship built on shared purpose, and the ability to disagree openly, and a common dry sense of humor about the absurdities of institutional church bureaucracy. Howard is engaged to a woman in Winnipeg who joins them in 1911, and Mabel is genuinely glad for him, and there is perhaps a moment, when she allows herself to register what she gave up when she said no to Fletcher. She does not record this moment. It exists only as a 2-week gap in her journal, which she never explains. The work is real. She can see it. She watches girls who came to her unable to write their own names stand up in the Linfen market and negotiate prices with absolute authority. She watches women who had been given no voice in their own households begin to understand that they have one. She does not romanticize this. She knows the structures of village life are deep and old and do not shift easily. But she watches the changes, however partial, and she believes. And then she prays for a man named Old Chen. Old Chen is brought to her dispensary in the spring of 1912 by his son, who is one of the school's former students. Old Chen is 64 years old, a carpenter, and he has a growth on his neck the size of a fist that the doctor in the provincial capital has refused to treat, because he is determined the man is too old for the risk of surgery. Howard examines it, and his face is careful, and still in the way that Mabel has learned means he is choosing how to say something. He pulls her aside and says quietly, "There's nothing I can do for him." That night, Mabel prays over Old Chen for 3 hours. She does not tell Howard. She is not sure she could explain what she does. It is not a performance, not a formula. It is something more like arguing with God, pressing into the darkness with her hands on an old man's neck and refusing to accept that this is the end. By midnight she is so exhausted she is barely coherent. She falls asleep in the chair beside his cot. In the morning the growth is smaller. Howard examines it twice. He doesn't say anything for a long time. Then he says, "I've read about this kind of spontaneous remission. It does happen." Mabel looks at him. He meets her eyes. He says, "Very rarely." Within 2 weeks it is gone. Old Chen goes home to his son. He lives another 11 years. Mabel does not report this in her mission newsletter. She records it in her private journal with 4 sentences and then does not return to it. She is not comfortable with miracles as spectacle. She believes they happen. She does not believe they are meant to be made into arguments. Now, when was the last time you prayed with your whole being for something impossible? Not as a performance, not as a formula, but as a genuine, desperate argument with the living God. The First World War reaches China as a shadow, a distant catastrophe that changes the flow of money and personnel, without changing the immediate reality of the dispensary and the school. But it takes Howard Elkin. He enlists in 1960 field surgery, France, and is killed at Passchendaele in October 1917. His wife, Margaret, returns to Winnipeg with their 2 children. Mabel sits in the empty dispensary for an evening after the telegram arrives and feels the dimensions of the loss in a way she doesn't let herself feel in front of anyone else. She writes to his wife, "I want you to know that Howard worked with absolute faithfulness and joy every day I knew him. He was the best colleague I ever had. The work he did here is still living. I believe you will see him again. I am holding on to that belief for both of us right now." She means every word of it. She also knows it doesn't remove the grief. She has learned by now that faith and grief are not opposites. She is 48 years old. She has spent 23 years in China. She is not done. The 1920s bring new upheaval, the warlord period, then the rise of Chinese nationalism, then the complicated, dangerous landscape of a country in violent transition. The mission board in Toronto writes to Mabel with increasing anxiety, suggesting she consider relocating to the coast, where things are more stable. She replies, each time, with a polite and detailed explanation of why she cannot leave, followed by a list of things the mission board could do that would actually help. The mission board finds these replies difficult. But the 1920s also bring Grace. Grace is the daughter of a former student, one of the original 12 girls Mabel had hidden during the Boxer crisis. She arrives at the school in 1922, 14-year-old, with her mother's same high forehead and the kind of quiet attention in her eyes that Mabel recognizes immediately as intelligence waiting for room to move. Grace is extraordinary. Within 2 years, she is teaching the younger students. Within 5 years, she is managing the school's daily operations with an efficiency that makes Mabel realize, for the first time, that the work she has built does not depend entirely on her. This is the most important thing she has understood, and she understands it with a kind of painful gratitude, because it means the work will survive her, and it also means she has been, in some ways, a bottleneck all along. She begins to hand things over, slowly, imperfectly. She is not good at letting go. She knows this about herself, records it in her journal with characteristic self-honesty. I have trouble trusting others to do what I would do. This is not humility. This is control. I am asking God to change it. It changes, slowly. By 1930, Grace is the school's principal in all but title. The clinic has become a small hospital. 40 beds, 3 trained nurses, a young Chinese doctor fresh from medical school in Shanghai, who has come home to Linfen specifically because of the work Mabel started. Mabel herself teaches 1 class a week and prays with patients and writes letters and keeps the institutional memory alive. She is 60 years old. She has white hair and reading glasses and the bearing of someone who has walked through fire and come out not unburned but unbroken. And then the Japanese invasion comes. December 1937. Nanking falls. The horror of what happens there reaches Linfen in fragments. Rumor first, then the accounts of refugees, then the terrible confirmation. Mabel writes in her journal, "I have no framework for this. I have believed, all my life, that God is sovereign. I still believe it, but I am looking at what human beings are capable of, and I am struggling badly." She does not leave. Grace does not leave. The hospital stays open. They treat Chinese soldiers and Japanese soldiers and civilians, and they do not ask who is which, because Mabel learned a long time ago that the man bleeding in front of you is the man in front of you, and the question of his politics is for another day. In the winter of 1938, Japanese forces occupy Linfen. A Japanese officer comes to the hospital and tells Mabel she must leave. She tells him, in Mandarin, because her Japanese is non-existent and she refuses to speak English in a negotiation, that she is not leaving and that the hospital is a neutral medical facility and that she has been here for 43 years and intends to be buried here, and he is welcome to shoot her if he disagrees. He stares at her for a long moment. She stares back. He leaves. He comes back 2 days later with a superior officer. The same conversation, more or less. She does not waver. Eventually, after weeks of bureaucratic back and forth that she describes in her journal with exhausted brevity, the hospital is permitted to remain open under Japanese military oversight, which is a compromise she hates and accepts. She is 68 years old. She has been sick since the winter, a respiratory infection she can't shake. She notes it in her journal in passing, between entries about hospital supplies and a prayer request for a woman in the maternity ward. She does not flag it as serious. She doesn't think it is serious. She has had worse, but it doesn't improve. By spring of 1939, it has settled into her lungs in the way that things settle when a body has been running at full capacity for 4 decades and finally encounters something it cannot simply push through. Grouse sits with her in the evenings. The young doctor, Dr. Liang, does what he can, which is not enough. On the night of April 22, 1939, Grace reads to her from the Psalms. Mabel is barely conscious. She surfaces once and says clearly, to no one in particular, "Tell them it wasn't about me." Then she sleeps again. She does not wake. She is 69 years old. At her memorial service, held in the school she founded, Grace stands before the assembled students and teachers and says, "Miss Moyer came to Linfen before I was born. She came when this city had no school for girls. She came when the road here was a day's walk from the nearest train. She came because God told her to, and because she believed, not that she was important, but that the people here were. That is the only reason any of this exists, not her greatness, her obedience." The school she founded still operates today, now a state secondary school, its origins scrubbed from the official record, but the building still standing, the curriculum still shaped by the belief that girls deserve education. The hospital became a district medical center. The women she trained as midwives trained others, and those women trained others, and the ripple has gone further than anyone can track. Grace herself went on to found 3 additional schools in surrounding villages, retiring in 1961. On her retirement, she was asked what had most influenced her life. She said, "A woman from Canada who stayed when she should have left and let go when she should have stayed. I am still trying to learn the difference." But here is what Mabel herself would want you to sit with. Not the miracles, not the survival, not even the legacy. She wrote this in her journal in 1935, 4 years before she died, when she was reviewing her life with clear eyes. "I came here believing God would protect me from loss. He did not. I lost people I loved. I lost years. I lost the life I might have had if I had said yes to Fletcher and stayed in Ontario and taught school and grown old in the country of my birth. What I was not prepared for was that I would not, in the end, wish those losses away. The loss and the calling are the same thing. You cannot have one without the other. The question is not whether the price is too high. The question is whether you trust the one who set the price." What about you? Mabel Moyer spent her life asking God to use her, not dramatically, not publicly, just use me, in whatever room I am in, with whatever I have in my hands. She proved that ordinary obedience, carried far enough, becomes something the world cannot ignore. If this story has stirred something in you, leave a comment below with, "Use me, God, this generation is waiting." And if you want to go deeper, if you want more stories of men and women who gave everything and found that everything was not enough, and yet somehow more than enough, subscribe to Heart of Witnesses and hit the notification bell. Every week we bring you a story that the history books have forgotten but heaven has not. Here's your challenge this week. Spend 15 minutes in silence. Not in prayer exactly, not asking for anything, just in the presence of God. Mabel called this keeping the channel open. She believed the power did not come from her, it came through her. Because she stayed open. Because she stayed. What if the greatest miracle God wants to do in this generation is not through some extraordinary figure from the past, but through someone ordinary, watching this video, in an ordinary city, who finally says yes?